It was a quiet night at the hospital, with emergency lights casting a faint glow against the sterile walls, creating a sense of calm. Nurses and doctors working the night shift exchanged soft words, their movements smooth and efficient as occasional footsteps echoed in the empty hallways. Tonight seemed like just another uneventful shift, until the automatic doors at the entrance suddenly slid open. Everyone assumed it was another patient entering, but instead, a German shepherd appeared. His coat was matted with dry mud, and his deep, soulful eyes reflected both exhaustion and determination. This was Max, a retired police canine who had served with distinction. He walked with purpose, carrying something gently in his mouth, wrapped in an old cloth. The nurses exchanged surprised glances. One of them hesitated but eventually stepped forward, her curiosity overcoming her fear. As the bundle was slowly unwrapped, it felt as if the air had been sucked out of the room. Inside was a tiny baby, fragile and struggling to breathe. The skin was pale, and the chest rose and fell erratically. "Oh my God, it's a baby," a nurse gasped, her voice trembling with shock. The calm of the night was shattered as the emergency room came to life. Nurses and doctors rushed into action, their hurried footsteps filling the hall as they quickly prepared equipment to stabilize the infant. Every second felt like a ticking countdown. Max stood still, calm and quiet, watching the scene unfold. His eyes, however, held a desperate plea for help. Despite his exhaustion, he didn't show any signs of fear or distress. He was simply waiting for a miracle. The team worked furiously, assessing the baby's condition. "Check his breathing and heart rate," one of the doctors instructed. A nurse carefully unwrapped the cloth further, revealing the baby's icy cold skin. The child was severely dehydrated and malnourished, and the lead doctor quickly called for N4. "We need to stabilize his respiration immediately." The heart monitor beeped slowly and weakly, signaling just how critical the situation was. A nurse swiftly connected the baby to an oxygen supply, adjusting the flow with delicate hands. As the team worked, one of the nurses kept glancing back at Max, who remained near the entrance. He didn't move, didn't bark, didn't growl. He simply stood there, his eyes filled with an almost human-like intelligence. It was as if he knew this was his mission, his purpose. The doctors and nurses continued their frantic efforts, each one doing their part to save the fragile infant's life. Despite their best efforts, the child's condition remained critical. Yet, with Max's quiet presence in the room, something about the situation felt different. The calmness in the dog's eyes seemed to act as a counterbalance to the growing tension in the emergency room. Max, clearly exhausted, never moved from his spot. His gaze never left the baby, and even though the room was filled with the rush of medical professionals, Max remained unwavering, almost as if he knew he had completed his mission once he brought the baby to safety. One nurse, still in disbelief, whispered, "How did he know to bring the baby here?" The question hung in the air, but no one had an answer. All they knew was that Max had done what many would consider impossible. He had brought the child to the hospital in what appeared to be a desperate attempt to save a life. The baby's vitals were slowly starting to stabilize, but the medical team understood this was just the beginning. It would take time, and every minute would matter. The nurse carefully monitored the baby's oxygen levels, while another checked the child's body temperature. For the first time since the emergency began, the room felt just a little less tense. The child was not out of danger, but now, there was hope. Max remained at his post, unwavering. The doctors continued working in silence, the tension still thick in the air, yet a new sense of urgency had taken over. The baby was showing signs of recovery, but it was far from over. Max's presence was more than just comforting, it was a reminder that the bond between a man and his dog could go beyond the usual understanding of loyalty. It was clear that Max had been watching over the baby, guarding him like a protector. News of the incredible event quickly spread through the hospital, and it wasn't long before the police were notified. Officer Daniels, the lead investigator, arrived at the scene with his team. As they entered the emergency room, the nurses eagerly recounted the unbelievable story. "We don't know where the dog came from," the head nurse explained, still in shock. "He brought the baby in, placed him on the floor, and just stood there. That's all we know." Officer Daniels narrowed his eyes as he took in the scene. He observed Max, who was still standing near the entrance, his eyes vigilant and calm, as if on a mission. The officers were having trouble believing the story, but the dog's composure was undeniable. "That's hard to believe," Daniels murmured. "A dog carrying a baby into the hospital? Does anyone know where he came from?" He asked if anyone had tried to scan the dog for a chip. One of the officers approached Max cautiously with a scanner. But as soon as the officer got too close, Max backed away, his body tense but not aggressive. His eyes never left the officer, his alertness making it clear that he wasn't comfortable with the approach. "This dog's been trained," the officer remarked. "He's likely a retired canine." Daniels nodded in agreement and slowly approached Max, speaking softly to the dog. "Easy there, buddy," he said. Max studied him for a moment, then allowed the officer to attach a leash to his collar. It was clear that the dog was allowing them to take control, but only on his terms. Max then led the officers out of the hospital and into the city streets. His movements were deliberate, calm, and purposeful, as if he knew exactly where he was going. The officers followed closely, the flashing lights of their patrol cars casting long shadows along the pavement. The tension in the air grew with every passing block. "Where is he taking us?" one of the officers murmured. Finally, Max stopped in front of an old, dilapidated house in a rundown part of town. The front door was slightly ajar, as though someone had left in a hurry. Daniels frowned. "This is it," he said quietly. The officers exchanged uneasy glances before cautiously approaching the entrance. The smell of mold and stale air hit them as they stepped inside, and they quickly moved through the cluttered living room. Max led them toward a small door at the back of the house, his pace steady and unwavering. As the officers cautiously opened the door to the back room, the air inside seemed to grow heavier. It was a dimly lit space, filled with dust and forgotten remnants of a life once lived. In the corner stood an old, dusty crib. The room was a quiet, eerie testament to neglect, a place left behind in a hurry. Scattered around the crib were a few signs that someone had once lived here: an empty dog food bowl, a tattered blanket, and several children's items strewn haphazardly across the floor. Max approached the crib, sniffing the spot where the baby had once been. His posture was exhausted, but his eyes remained sharp. He was no longer standing at attention, but he was alert, his body tense with a quiet understanding of the task he had completed. After the long journey from the hospital to this dilapidated house, Max finally allowed himself to collapse beside the crib. His body went limp, his mission now complete. One officer, unable to shake the weight of the situation, whispered, "The baby was here." His voice was hard, his face grim as he took in the scene. The other officers stood silently, absorbing the truth of the moment. Max lay beside the crib, still watchful, despite his obvious exhaustion. His body, worn from the long ordeal, had finally allowed him to rest. The officers, their own fatigue creeping in, continued to search the house, their flashlights cutting through the layers of dust and debris. The floors creaked underfoot as they moved deeper into the abandoned house. Chairs were overturned, cabinets were left open and empty, and the dining table was cluttered with crumpled papers, traces of a life that had been abandoned without warning. One officer remarked as he flipped through the papers on the table, "It looks like whoever lived here left in a hurry." Meanwhile, another officer ventured into the kitchen. The sink was filled with dirty dishes, and the faint odor of rotting food lingered in the air. On the countertop, a crumpled envelope caught his attention. He opened it carefully and found a handwritten letter inside. The officer began reading it aloud to the others. "I no longer have the strength to care for him. Everything around me is falling apart. All I have left is Max, and I know he'll do the right thing. I hope that one day someone will forgive me. The officer's voice trailed off as the final words echoed in the stillness of the room. The letter wasn't signed, but its message was clear. The author had been at the end of their rope, and in an act of desperation, they had entrusted their child's safety to Max, the loyal dog who had remained by their side through everything. "This dog has been watching over the baby this whole time," one officer murmured as he looked at Max, who was still lying by the crib, his body tired but his eyes unwavering. The weight of the situation was clear. Max had fulfilled his mission of safeguarding the child, and now, the police had to find the woman who had entrusted her child to the dog. They knew that Rachel, the baby's mother, was in serious trouble. There was no time to waste. Daniels issued orders for the officers to canvass the neighbors. After some time, they found an elderly man who recalled seeing the woman who had lived in the house. He described her as always being with a large dog. "I think she was going through a tough time," he said, leaning on his cane. "I saw her with a baby a few months ago, but then she just disappeared." The officers now had a clearer picture. Rachel had been struggling, overwhelmed by hardship, and in a moment of desperation, she had placed her trust in Max to protect her son. Based on the clues from the letter and the neighbor's account, the search intensified. Hours later, they received a report of a young woman wandering, exhausted, in a nearby park. When the officers arrived, they found Rachel sitting motionless on a bench. Her eyes were vacant, her face gaunt, and her hair unkempt. Daniels approached cautiously, choosing his words carefully. "We found a child who was brought to the hospital. A dog led us to an abandoned house nearby. Do you know anything about this? We need to ensure the child's safety." At the mention of the child's name, Rachel's eyes widened with shock and hope. "Noah, is it my son? Is he alive?" she stammered, her voice trembling as tears streamed down her face. She brought her hands to her mouth, shaking uncontrollably with emotion. Daniels exchanged glances with his team, recognizing the signs that they had found the right person. He nodded gently, his voice reassuring. "We found him. Noah is currently receiving treatment at the hospital. He's stable, but still under observation." The relief in Rachel's face was almost palpable as she broke down into sobs. After days of despair, she finally heard a glimmer of hope. Medical personnel quickly placed her on a stretcher to assess her condition, and as they made their way back to the hospital, Rachel began to tell her story. "Noah's father abandoned us right after he was born," she said, her voice raw with pain. "I tried to hold on, but everything fell apart. We ran out of food, out of money. I couldn't keep going." Rachel paused, her eyes distant as she relived the dark memories. "Max, he was always there for us. He never left my side, or Noah's. When I was too weak to go on, I told Max. I asked him to take Noah somewhere safe." The officers and medical staff in the ambulance absorbed the gravity of her words. The idea of a dog guiding a child to safety seemed impossible, but Max had done exactly that. When the ambulance arrived at the hospital, Rachel was escorted to the pediatric care unit. Her heart raced as she approached the door, but despite his exhaustion, Max walked beside her, his gaze steady and watchful. Inside, Rachel saw her son lying on a small bed, surrounded by medical equipment. His breathing was steady, and his skin no longer looked pale. Tears filled Rachel's eyes as she gently placed her hands on his tiny face. "Noah, my baby," she whispered, her voice cracking with emotion. Max stood silently at the doorway, watching over them, as if he understood the importance of this moment. Rachel turned to him, overwhelmed with gratitude. "Thank you, Max. You saved my son. You saved my family," she said softly, her voice trembling with emotion. The doctors and officers who had witnessed the entire story stood quietly, moved by the profound moment unfolding before them. Max was no ordinary dog. He was a protector, a silent hero who had fulfilled his mission with unwavering loyalty and love. As Rachel stood by Noah's side, her heart swelled with gratitude and disbelief. The hospital staff continued their work around her, monitoring her son's condition. The medical team had done their best, but the real hero of the night had been Max. This loyal German shepherd, who had spent days protecting the fragile baby, had saved them both. Max remained near the doorway, his posture still alert, his eyes never leaving the pair. He was a picture of calm, as if his mission had not yet been completed. The doctors marveled at his devotion to the child, a bond that transcended human understanding. Rachel, her emotions a mix of relief and sorrow, sat in the chair beside Noah's bed. Her hands gently brushed the baby's hair, and she whispered softly, "We made it, Noah. We're going to be okay now." Max wagged his tail slightly at the sound of her voice, as though he understood every word she said. The nurses and doctors who had witnessed the unfolding of the extraordinary events exchanged looks of admiration. One of the nurses, overcome by the gravity of the situation, approached Max. She bent down and gently patted his head, whispering, "You're a real hero, Max. Thanks to you, this little boy is alive." Max seemed to acknowledge the praise, his tail wagging once more. Rachel turned to look at the dog, her eyes filled with profound gratitude. "Thank you, Max," she whispered. "I don't know what we would have done without you." The room fell into a brief, reverent silence as the medical team continued to monitor Noah. Hours passed, and slowly, Noah began to show signs of recovery. His breathing steadied, and his tiny body warmed to a healthier temperature. The staff marveled at the strength of the baby, whose survival seemed almost miraculous. Yet, none of them could deny the role Max had played in making it possible. Rachel stayed by Noah's side, her eyes never leaving him, as the doctors and nurses worked tirelessly. They ensured he received the best care possible. Max, though exhausted, remained close, ever watchful, a silent sentinel. His loyalty had saved a life, and now, he could rest, though, it seemed, he didn't wish to. After several hours, the doctors confirmed that Noah was out of critical condition and was steadily improving. The staff, relieved but exhausted, exchanged smiles as they saw the baby's condition stabilize. For Rachel, it was a bittersweet moment. She had never imagined a night like this, full of horror, hope, and heroism. But in the end, it was Max who had changed everything. Meanwhile, social workers began stepping in to help Rachel. They helped her secure temporary housing and made sure she had access to support for herself and her son. The system that had failed her for so long was finally offering a glimmer of hope. By the time Rachel was discharged from the hospital, Noah was well enough to leave. They were greeted by the morning sun as they exited the building, the bright light casting a warm glow on their faces. Rachel held Noah in her arms, feeling the weight of the last few days lift as she stepped into the fresh air. She smiled down at him, her eyes filled with new hope for their future. Max, who had not left their side, walked beside them, his posture steady and protective. His presence was a silent reassurance, as if he knew his mission was far from over. His watchful eyes never strayed from Rachel and Noah, ensuring their safety as they stepped into a new chapter of their lives. Rachel bent down to stroke Max's head. "We made it, Max. Thanks to you, we have a chance to start over," she whispered softly, her voice full of emotion. Max, ever calm, looked at her with his wise, loyal eyes. He seemed to understand the weight of her words, and for a brief moment, Rachel felt a deep connection with the dog who had saved her family. He had not only protected them physically but had given them the chance to rebuild their lives, to find hope after a long, painful journey. As they made their way to their new home, the community began to learn of their emotional story. Word spread quickly, and strangers reached out to offer support. They brought clothes, food, toys for Noah, and even job opportunities for Rachel. People were moved by the story of a dog who had gone above and beyond to protect a family in need. The first few days in their new home were filled with challenges, but with the support of their neighbors and Max's unwavering loyalty, Rachel felt stronger than ever. For the first time in a long time, she didn't feel alone. As Noah crawled across the floor, his bright eyes full of wonder, Rachel looked at Max. "We made it through, Max," she said softly, stroking the dog's head. Max looked back at her, his eyes calm, as if to say, "I knew you would." Max's story was not just one of miraculous survival. It was a story of love, loyalty, and sacrifice, a testament to the extraordinary bond between a dog and his family. Rachel, Noah, and Max had faced unimaginable challenges, yet they had emerged stronger, united by a love that transcended all boundaries. Rachel's journey was far from over. With Max by her side and a renewed sense of hope, she began to rebuild her life. The support of her community and the love of her loyal dog gave her the strength she needed to move forward. For the first time in a long time, she felt like she could breathe. Noah's recovery was steady, and with each passing day, he grew stronger. Rachel's heart swelled with pride as she watched her son begin to thrive. Her life had changed in ways she couldn't have imagined, but with Max's guidance and the love of her child, she knew she could face whatever came next. As the days went on, the story of Max's heroism spread throughout the community, touching the hearts of everyone who heard it. People were inspired by the loyalty and bravery of the dog who had saved a life, and his story became a beacon of hope for others. Rachel, Noah, and Max had found a new beginning. It wasn't easy, but with the love of her son and the loyalty of her dog, Rachel knew she had everything she needed to build a better future. And Max? He was content, knowing that he had fulfilled his purpose. He had saved a life and brought a family back from the brink of despair. His loyalty and courage had changed everything, and that was more than enough for him. As they settled into their new life, Rachel whispered once more to Max, "Thank you. You've given us everything." And Max, ever watchful, nodded his head slightly, as if to say, "It was my honor."